everyone, and welcome to my channel, RPG Retro Reviews, where I, Captain Courageous, review old school modules and games and talk about how you might use them in your current campaigns. Now, this video was supposed to be my review of the City of Brass module from Fraud God Games, but this massive tome of over 500 pages has taken a bit to get through, so in the meantime, I thought it might be fun to just meander a bit from reviews to a discussion of H.P. Lovecraft and his Cthulhu mythos and Robert Howard's Conan the Cimmerian, or Conan the Barbarian, as it pertains to Dungeons & Dragons, and specifically to OSR games. Sound like fun? I thought so, so let's just get right to it. The origins of Dungeons & Dragons clearly have a strong influence from the pulp, fantasy, and weird tales fiction magazines from the 1920s and 30s, of which Gary Gygax, one of the creators of Dungeons & Dragons, was heavily influenced and a big fan of. In fact, one can easily make the claim that despite the presence of dwarves and elves and other hallmarks of the epic fantasy tale, Dungeons & Dragons, especially at the early levels of the game, more closely resemble the sword and sorcery subgenre, with small groups of relatively weak heroes investigating dungeons and fighting low-level threats, rather than the world-spanning battles of good versus evil, which is more commonly associated with the epic fantasy tale. Gygax himself spoke of this several times, but the inclusion of elves and dwarves and a cease and desist order from the Tolkien estate in the early days of D&D seemed to cement in many people's minds Tolkien's influence on the game. In an early 1974 article by Gygax for a miniatures war game fanzine called La Vivandière, he writes, "Take several of Tolkien's heroic figures, for example. Would a participant in a fantasy game more readily identify with a bard of Dale, Aragorn, Frodo Baggins, or would he rather relate to Conan, Favard the Grey Mouser, or Elric of Melniboné? The answer seems all too obvious. It seems that Tolkien's primary influence on the game was to provide a handful of interesting creatures for the players to face, and some player character races and classes for the players to play, but the actual play of the game itself is more akin to the pulp fantasy tales of Robert E. Howard's Conan or Fritz Leiber's Favard and the Grey Mouser than Tolkien. But in the end, the game mingles all of this together to come up with a unique amalgam of both styles of fantasy. Certainly, if you look at the character classes, the cavalcade of influences on the game is readily apparent. The paladin, the holy warrior, and the cleric, drawing from medieval history and probably King Arthur and the Arthurian legends. The thief, clearly inspired by Fritz Leiber. The ranger, certainly inspired by Aragorn and Tolkien, and so on. The point is, the game is a hodgepodge of influences, which is great, and that it makes the game widely appealing to many people, which from a gaming standpoint is very important. However, if you, as the dungeon master, are trying to narrow the scope of your campaign to a specific theme or style of fantasy fiction, then the inclusion of so many disparaging elements can make things difficult on the referee to do so. What is really fascinating is the influence of H.P. Lovecraft on the game, both directly and indirectly. Lovecraft, Robert Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, and to some extent Fritz Leiber were all part of an avid letter-writing circle in which the men complimented each other on their stories, made suggestions, and borrowed ideas from each other's tales. Both Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard created stories based off the Greek myth of Hyboria, but their versions vary quite a bit, with Howard's Hyborian Age and the Conan the Barbarian being the most well-known and popular today. Yet Lovecraft, Howard, and Smith shared a creative feedback loop whereby elements of each other's stories would show up in the other. This was not a planned collaboration. This simply evolved from conversations and a mingling of ideas. Certainly there is an infusion of tone. With both Lovecraft and Howard, you have ancient gods and great old ones, mysterious tomes of ancient knowledge, and cults worshipping these ancient powers, seeking to have them rise again. Though, with Lovecraft, these higher entities are beings of undefeatable power and the knowledge of their existence will drive one to insanity, whereas with Howard, these entities provide adversaries for his brutish barbarian Conan to defeat. Thus, since D&D takes inspiration from Conan the Barbarian and Howard's works, by extension, it takes influence from Lovecraft. When it comes to direct influences, it's hard to deny that the mysterious and horrific mind flayers are not inspired by Cthulhu, and not just in resemblance. The game has evil tomes from old powers as well. Consider the Book of Vile Darkness. So let's say that as a DM, you'd like to create a Dungeons & Dragons style campaign that mimics more the pulpy fantasy style and with Lovecraftian elements of D&D and wish to diminish the Tolkien-esque influences. How might one go about making sure that the setting reflects these desires? In this example, I'm using old school D&D, either the original white box set or an OSR clone like Labyrinth Lord, Swords and Wizardry, Delving Deeper, or Old School Essentials. The reason for using these games rather than a newer iteration is that the games are so basic there will be less fluff to sculpt out of the system than if you have something like, say, 5th edition, which not only has a myriad of classes and many subclass options that you simply just don't want in this style of campaign. So the first thing that really needs to be done is to direct the player's entry into the setting by altering the race and class choices available to reflect the setting. One of the things that I did for my Primeval full setting was to eliminate dwarves, elves, halfling, and other Tolkien-esque elements, and generally made the only playable race humans. Then, rather than race, it is the human culture that provides a variety of in-game benefits, taking the place of the part demi-human races play in the game. For example, you might say in your Hyborian game that people from the lands of Samaria produce fierce warriors, and that gives them a +1 to strength and -1 to intelligence. Furthermore, they are prone to rages or go berserk and gain a +2 to attacks, refusing to leave combat until all enemies are dead. Sumerians can progress as either fighters in an unlimited capacity or thieves to the 5th level. Or those folks from the legend-haunted lands of Stygia are known for producing the most powerful sorcerers. They gain +1 to intelligence and a -1 to strength. They can progress unlimited as sorcerers and assassins, but only 5th level as fighters and thieves. You might alter magic so that it has a corrupting effect on those who use it, causing them to gain peculiar characteristics like scales or glowing red eyes and a slow, inevitable slide towards evil. The sorcerer has access to what is traditionally arcane and divine type magic, with the zealot cultist being more clerical than arcane. In any event, they usually have access to the reversible versions of clerical spells, but not the prime spell. For example, sorcerers cause wounds, but can't cure them. They cause disease, but can't cure disease, and so on. A roll of some type is required when invoking magic, with failure causing some minor effect or failing utterly. A saving throw might be required, and if failure is indicated, the sorcerer slides 1 point more towards corruption. Healing magic might be available, but limited to long, drawn-out rituals and carefully prepared potions, further enforcing the gritty, rugged nature of the setting. Classes available might be restricted to assassins, scalds, fighters, thieves, and the aforementioned sorcerers that are a weird amalgam of magic user and cleric. If you do allow non-human races, you might offer alternate choices that are more in keeping with the grittier pulp setting. For example, there might be a degenerate race of Serpent Men, whose civilization predates the current one, and whose cataclysmic end brought about much of the ruins that dot the landscape. Or a race of intelligent Minotaurs, whose civilization is on the rise in the wild jungle lands to the south. Or perhaps a race of sea people who, while younger, appear completely human, but as they age, they turn more and more sea-like until they devolve entirely and return to the sea. Also, keep in mind player creativity. While the Tolkien dwarves, elves, and halflings are gone, a creative player might come up with something that fits your setting that you didn't think of, so leave room in your setting for that kind of expansion. Sourcebooks for settings like Conan are out there, of course. Let me recommend The Return to the Road of Kings from Mongoose Publishing. This is a near system-free sourcebook that does an excellent job of outlining the lands of Hyboria and would make an excellent source for a campaign. To add in your Lovecraftian elements, I can't recommend highly enough The Realms of Crawling Chaos from Goblinoid Games, produced for the Labyrinth Lord game system. Even if you do not use Labyrinth Lord, the nature of OSR means it'll work for Blue Home, Old School Essentials, Delving Deeper, Swords and Wizardry, or any other retro clone you prefer. This sourcebook has a list of potential Lovecraftian races like Sea Bloods or the Subhumans that are perfect to fit right in with a Conesque style setting, as they are corrupted human races. There is also an excellent list of dark, inherently corrupting spells and rituals to add to the sorcerer's class, as well as Lovecraftian creatures like Elder Things, Haunters in the Dark, and Deep Ones. In regards to creatures, you might want to sculpt out the Sylvian and Tolkienesque type creatures and replace them with more primal, pulpy style creatures like giant snakes, serpent men, oozes, slimes, and jellies. Get rid of orcs and replace them with beastmen, which are more akin to wild, Neanderthal degenerate humans. In fact, it is some version of human, degenerate or otherwise, that provides most of the adversaries the players face. Bizarre human sacrificing cults that worship ancient primordial entities of powerful sorcerers, or powerful sorcerers whose search for eldritch power has corrupted them, turning them into something less than human and bent on evil and cruelty. Or an isolated group of humans who were forced underground a millennia ago, like the Morlocks from H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. In fact, adding some subtle science fiction elements is totally in keeping with the old school style of D&D and the pulp fantasy setting we're trying to foster here. In the classic story by H.P. Lovecraft, At the Mountains of Madness, a group of explorers in the Arctic uncover an ancient city built by the Elder Things 100 million years ago, but ultimately destroyed by their servant slaves of Shoggoth. Shoggoth make an excellent D&D monster resembling a black pudding. Thus, putting these elements together with the ones we've sculpted out now creates a darker, grittier fantasy horror science fiction amalgam, more in keeping with the weird tale story of the 20s and 30s, and less Tolkien than more modern takes on fantasy. Anyway, I just wanted to do something a little different as I release a new group of videos this month, including the City of Brass. Thank you for your patience in that regard and your viewership. Definitely let's open up the comments on this video and talk about what elements you, as a DM, might have brought to your setting in regards to running a pulp fantasy campaign. Please subscribe, check the little bell so you get notifications when I upload more videos. Please consider supporting me on Patreon and join my Facebook group for more discussions about old school games. The links are in the description. And as always, my friends, may your D20 roll true and game on.